All right. Looks like we have quite a nice group here, so why don't we go ahead and get started. I'm Andy Rich. I'm the Dean of the Colin Powell School. I want to welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. For those who don't know, the Colin Powell School is the School of Social Sciences at City College. We have somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 students. We have almost 1,000 students who are about ready to graduate and will graduate in just a couple of weeks. And we're everything from psychology to economics, political science to sociology, anthropology, international studies, and we're most of the public service-oriented and leadership development programs at City College. We are, I think, fundamentally concerned with public problems and with preparing the next generation of leaders to engage them in ways where they will affect positive change in our world. And for us, this moment and this crisis, I think, point to myriad problems that require leadership. And as we speak at this moment, we're coming, I think, to a better understanding of the problems in our institutions, the problems in the ideologies that exist around our institutions and the processes that govern decision-making, both here in the United States and around the world. And we're noticing challenges and problems with our leadership and our leaders. And in some sense, all of that in the context of the response to the pandemic by scientists, by policymakers, by economists, by community leaders, that's our subject for today's conversation. And we have 5 members of our faculty who have kindly agreed to address different aspects of the pandemic response. So let me just introduce them briefly, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. David Jeruzalmi is a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at City College, and he's going to speak about how we got to this place from a scientific and medical standpoint and a public health standpoint, and where we're headed from a scientific perspective. Rajan Menon is the Spitzer Chair in International Relations at the Colin Powell School, and he's going to help us assess the crisis against the kind of larger global political, economic, and policy context in which it is occurring. Marta Bengoa is Associate Professor of Economics at the Colin Powell School and will consider the economic and the business implications of the pandemic. Katherine Chen is Associate Professor of Sociology at the Colin Powell School. She's going to talk about the organizational response and really the challenges to an organizational response during this crisis. And then finally, we will close with Stan Altman. Stan is a visiting professor of public affairs at the Colin Powell School. He will speak to us about the digital divide at the local response here in New York City, and he will end with lessons from another era and a different type of leader, Bernard Baruch, who is a City College alum. So what we've organized this so that each speaker will make opening remarks for about 5 to 7, 8 minutes. And then we will invite an exchange and a Q&A. We want to keep this as much of a discussion as possible and as kind of open for involvement from everyone who is participating. But I'd ask you to remain muted unless you're going to ask a question. And if you'd like to ask a question, I'd ask that you signal that to me over in the chat section, and then I'll create a queue for questions, which we'll get to at the end. One last note, we are recording this event. The speakers have all agreed for us to be recording it, and I wanted to let everybody else know too. So with that, let me turn it over to David to get us started.
Okay, I'm going to just share a screen here. Okay, you can all see my slide?
Yes, there we go.
Okay. Okay. Great, thank you, Andy, for the invitation to participate. And I just want to say that I think any discussion of the current pandemic, and really any pandemic, has to start with the underlying science, but this discussion can't end there. The discussion must always include economics, politics, sociology, public policy, amongst other disciplines. And that's what we're doing here today. So I want to start with two foundational pieces of information about size and scale. For example, how big is a virus? And then I want to say a few words about the flow of information in the cell, and this will help us understand what a virus does to a cell. And then I'm going to address three questions. What is a virus? How do we detect the presence of a virus? And how might we eliminate the virus from humans? Okay, so let's start with the question, how small is a virus, or how big or small is a virus? So what I'm showing you here is a length scale, and you recognize, of course, meters and centimeters and millimeters, because these are part of our world. But biology takes place over a length scale that spans 10 orders of magnitude, as you see here, all the way down to the nanometer and smaller. And we live in a meter world, of course, and we're familiar with centimeters and millimeters. So this is an insect here that's about a couple of millimeters. And then you see a white blood cell that's in the micron range, and cells and microbes and other kinds of cells live in a micro world, and their world is 1,000,000 times smaller than ours. And then you see our sort of uninvited guest, who is the coronavirus, and an image of the coronavirus. And a coronavirus is about 100 nanometers in size, but the molecules that make the virus work and that it interacts with in the cell are smaller still, in the nanometer scale and smaller still. So those are operating in a world that's 1 billion times smaller than us. And so the virus, of course, is about 100 nanometers, and so it's about 10 to 100 times smaller than a cell. Okay. Flow of information in biology. Very important, fundamental to understand this. So what I'm showing you here is how information flows within a living cell. So of course, you know about, going from left to right, you know about DNA and double-stranded DNA. And DNA can be thought of as the genetic vault. This is where the cell keeps its most valuable secrets. And it's the plan to make a cell. And when the cell decides to actually make a product, it copies the code from the genetic vault into a temporary molecule called messenger RNA, which turns out to be a blueprint. And that is a blueprint which is sent to a factory, and it makes a protein. For example, here you see the protein hemoglobin, which is the oxygen carrier in our cells. So this is the fundamental and very highly simplified flow of information in the cell, from DNA to RNA to protein. Now you might be wondering why I'm telling you this. And I'm telling you this because a virus like SARS-CoV-2 understands this process very well and hijacks it for its own ends. So SARS-CoV-2 has a genome that's made up of RNA. And when the virus infects the cell, this viral blueprint hijacks this flow of information, and it to the end of making its own proteins and making more copies of itself. And as the virus infects the cell, the RNA hijacks the cell, makes more copies of itself. And once it's used up the cell, it moves to the next and the next and the next until something happens. Okay, so let's focus on the virus. And so what is a virus? And so I think the best and most informative definition of a virus was articulated by Sir Peter and Jean Medawar many years ago in their book, Aristotle to Zoos. It's a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein. And so many wonder, is a virus alive? So a virus is not alive in the conventional sense, and people argue about this. So a good way to think about it is it occupies that gray zone between a living and non-living organism. So it's not a cell. It does have a genome in the middle that's wrapped up in protein. And one of the hallmarks of a living organism is its ability to make energy. So a virus does not make energy. And really, a virus is a parasite. It requires a host to replicate. its genome can evolve, so it shares that with a cell, but it really requires a host to replicate. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the virus. And this is an image that was painted by David Goodsell, who is the premier illustrator of molecules in living systems of our time. And this is a wonderful work of art. So what you see here is this sort of spherical shaped viral particle. And you recognize the spike proteins that people are talking about. And this is what gives the virus its name, corona, which means crown. And the virus is an envelope protein. It has a membrane, and you see the membrane there. And the membrane is the reason why the hand sanitizers that have alcohol or isopropanol, why they neutralize the virus. And then as we go in deeper, you can see the genome, which is the little white squiggly things in the middle that are wrapped up with a protein that's in the lavender color. And this is all packaged up in the middle of the viral particle. Okay, so how do we detect the virus? So principally, there are two ways to do it. We can detect the presence of the viral genome in a human patient, or we can detect that the human patient has been exposed to viral proteins. So let me tell you about those. So how do we detect the viral genome? Well, there's in environmental samples like saliva or throat swab, there's very little virus present there. And so what we use is a so-called Xerox machine for genes. And its technical name is reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction. And what this does is, it is a Xerox machine. It takes a small amount of a genome and through several cycles exponentially amplifies that process to the point that we can detect it. And so that's the test that is being applied to test whether someone is positive for COVID. That's what that means. Now, later in infection, as the body mounts a response, the body produces special proteins called antibodies, which are trying to control the infection and get rid of the infection. And they're now coming to market tests that test whether a person has made these proteins. And that is a sign that the person has been exposed to the virus and may no longer have the virus in them, but they have been exposed in the past to the virus. So those are the two ways to detect. There are other ways. Those are the common ways to detect the presence of a virus. And what can we do to eliminate the virus? So things that have been in the news are shown here. There are three ways. This is not the only three ways, but you probably heard about convalescent plasma. And what convalescent plasma is plasma is the liquid that's left from blood when one removes the cells. It's a yellowish liquid. And so a patient who's recovered from the infection, the theory is that their plasma has antibodies in it that helped the patient recover. And if one could take those antibodies and give them to a sick patient, that it might help them recover. And this has shown some success. This is an old approach as well. We also have therapeutics, and then of course we'd all like to have a vaccine because then we can all come back to work. So the therapeutics are primarily are drugs that are made and developed to stop the virus's activity. So this is remdesivir, which has been in the news recently. This attacks the ability of the virus to copy itself and slows it down. It gums up the works and it messes things up. And in the process, it is hopefully showing some effect. And then, of course, a vaccine is basically an approach to train a person to be immune to the virus, to train the immune system of a person to no longer to be able to resist infection, and this lasts for a short period of time, depending on the vaccine. So I'll stop there, and I'll let my next colleague go. Let me stop sharing.
Great, thank you, David. Rajan?
Okay, let's see. And I've stopped sharing.
Now I'm unmuted. Thanks, Andy, for arranging this, and thanks to my colleagues for joining us. First, a word to the students who are out there. If you want to learn about this virus, and you should, both for your education and out of sheer self-interest, there are two databases to go to. One is the Johns Hopkins COVID database, which is extensive and updated every day. The other is the CDC database. There's some variations between the two for reasons that I won't get into, and David can explain better than I in any event. And then for science writing, that is journalists who are literate in science and write very well, I think the Atlantic Magazine's Ed Wong is unsurpassed. It is behind a paywall, the Atlantic, but you can get access to it because, like other magazines, the Atlantic has made its content, coronavirus content, free. So let me take you kind of quickly through the world, which means that it's going to be more of a Jackson Pollock painting than a Mughal miniatures, big splashes of paint without fine detail. Let me start with the US. This virus has torn through the US like a tornado, leaving destruction in its wake. And it's left the rest of the world, I think, surprised. Some are experiencing what Germans call Schadenfreude, taking delight in the misfortune of others, but others are simply stunned that in the world's richest country, we should have 1.1 million infections. That's about 27%, and about 69,700 deaths. That's about 31% of the total in the world. And that website should crash. People are talking about unemployment that could reach the levels of the Great Depression. James Bullard of the St. Louis Fed put out a report in which he made this projection, but even if he's wrong, it's going to be very, very high. And then, of course, thousands of cars in different parts of the world, different parts of the country, lining up before food banks. So in a short time, this has taken a huge toll. Remember, the first infection, if I remember correctly, in the state of Washington was at the end of January. And the first death was the end of February. So depending on how you count, we're 2 or 3 months into this, and it's taken a huge toll. The number of people who have died, just for comparison's sake, already exceeds by about 10,000 or 15,000 the number of people who died in the Vietnam War over a decade. Now, of course, the Vietnamese lost many more. That's not the point that I'm making. Now, there has been a call by politicians to rally around and engage in civic mindedness and a reminder that we're all in this together. And at some level, that's true. But I'd like to suggest to you that if anything, the virus has accentuated and highlighted once again the deep social divisions in our country. So we're not all in this together in the sense that some groups have been disproportionately affected relative to others. And the group that has been hit hardest, the groups, are those of low income and minority communities or people of color. The two often shade into one another. Now, that's not surprising, because if you think of healthcare services, if you think of the savings rate, if you think of low wages, if you think of underlying health conditions that make you more susceptible to the virus, these groups are statistically overrepresented in the population in each respect. They are simply less well equipped to weather this particular storm. So I'll give you one example. In the low wage sector of the economy, there are about 20 occupations, and I don't have time to go into them. There are about 16,000 jobs lost already, 16 million jobs lost already, and more are on the way. We are all fortunate to be in the Zoom economy. That is, we can work from home, and we complain about confinement and boredom and depression and so on. But others are not so lucky because they cannot work from home. They must go to where the work is. So if you're a cab driver or a bus driver or a janitor or an orderly in a hospital, or someone in the hospitality industry in a low-wage job, you are in very big trouble. Another example would be the cosmetics industry. Now, you can say, of course, that, well, there's unemployment and there's the CARE Act. Remember that unemployment in the United States is a shared program between the federal government and the state government, but administered by the states. And depending on which state you're in, the duration lasts between 12 and 26 weeks. And on average, it gives you about $300 to $400 a week, and it replaces about 30% on average of your income. So it's very helpful, but it's nowhere near the extensive social safety nets that you have in Europe. So vulnerability is distributed unequally. I'll give you just one other example. It's a small number relative to the population, but there are 3 million people, primarily in rural poor areas and in Native American communities, who do not have running water. Now, something such as hand washing that we do without a thought, for them, every day or very frequently is an obstacle. So let me turn now to the global economy, and I'll try not to poach too much on Marta's expertise.
Rajan, may I ask you,
let me finish, Yohanan, okay? Let me finish. And then I think there are questions at the end. One thing that's going to happen is that the public finances of every country in the world is going to be under a great deal of stress. So the IMF's latest projection is that public debt in wealthy countries by the end of this year will increase by 6 trillion. Now that puts them in a bind because on the one hand, there's the imperative of boosting the social safety nets and pumping money into the economy to help the most vulnerable. On the other hand, there's the question of fiscal prudence. There's also the question of what happens to the WTO. You may have noticed that in today's New York Times, there is already an article by Josh Hawley, who's a Republican, who calls for dismantling the WTO. And that's not going to happen. But I think in a much more competitive and constricted marketplace, you will have what we've already seen happening. That is increasing protectionism. This notion that globalization is this zeitgeist is completely ahistorical because we've had ups and downs in this process. So we are probably in for some disruptions in the global economy. The oil market is now under significant pressure. That matters to some countries. So Russia, for example, 60% of its exports come from oil and gas, and a third of its budget. So it is critically dependent on hydrocarbons, and if the price falls, despite price cuts recently by OPEC, Russia is in very, very big trouble. Now, let me move to China. The virus began there, and they've managed to control it. There are about 80,000 infections, far fewer than ours, by a magnitude of 10, and about 4,000 deaths, very small relative to the population. And deaths per 100,000, 0.33, compared to about 26.8 for us. We rank 8th in the world in deaths out of 1,000, and first in infections and first in deaths. But they have been able to do it through measures that are not easily replicable in liberal democracies. For example, requiring people to carry an app that tells a central database where people are at any given time and who they've had contact with. Civil liberties people have already raised objections to this if it were done in the United States. And they have draconian political controls that simply cannot be done here. The second is that they are now hostage to the global economy. So the schadenfreude business of looking at the United States and saying, oh, isn't it wonderful that the great competitor is suffering, won't quite work, because in 1970, before the Chinese economy took off in 1978, its exports as a percentage of GDP was about in the neighborhood of 5 to 7%. It's now about 19%. That may not be very high, but China and the rest of the global economy are like two scorpions in a bottle. If one moves too rapidly, the other gets stung. What about the EU? I think what you're already seeing is a division between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, to oversimplify things, just as you did in the 2008 Great Recession. Southern European countries are running much bigger deficits, are having much more financial problems. Italy, that's been very hard hit by the virus, as an example. And already Northern countries and the European Central Bank are balking about transferring resources. Recently, there was a big kerfuffle because a German magazine said, don't give money to the Italians because the mafia will take it. And the Italians, quite understandably, took exception, and Mrs. Merkel, the chancellor, apologized. In Europe, on the political front, I think this is fertile soil for populist groups of both the left and the right, neither of which, for different reasons, are very friendly toward democracy, and certainly populists of the right are not friendly toward immigration and refugees. And when you have crises like this, when public health concerns become a problem, there's always a danger of stigmatizing the so-called other. Let me move very quickly to Russia, which is the place I work on the most, but I'll say the least. Initially, when it happened, President Putin said, it sounds better in Russian, but we have this all completely under control. Thankfully, his coronavirus czar, the equivalent of Vice President Pence, is the mayor of Moscow, certain Sergei Sobyanin. And Sobyanin spent a lot of time taking Putin to school and telling him that this was going to be a very serious crisis, that it was nowhere near the peak, and Putin's tone has changed. So at the moment, about 2/3 of the cases in Russia have been in Moscow. Now, Moscow, relative to the rest of the country, has better public health services, more intellectual capital in hospitals and public health expertise, and so on. In some other parts of the country, these are all missing. So once the virus, as it already has, spreads to places like the Komi Republic in the Far East, or Stavropol in the south, you will have the death toll increase very, very significantly. And those regions are very, very poorly placed to deal with this problem. It comes at a particularly bad time for President Putin because, as some of you may know, the Russian constitution is about to be amended, enabling him to take a second set of 4-year terms, 8 years in all. Supposed to be a referendum. There was supposed to be what is the most important commemoration in Russia, the May 1 Victory Day parade to commemorate the victory over Nazi Germany. Finally, a word on less developed countries. There's no good name for them. Less developed countries is problematic. Third world countries is problematic because they're highly variable. But the following problems will strike them. Overseas development assistance, which is on average about 0.7%, or actually less. For us, it's about 0.2%. Foreign aid, you can call it, is going to be under much more pressure, and they're going to get less. Foreign direct investment, also less. Offshoring, that is, if companies decide they don't want to deal with complicated supply chains anymore because this disease has taught them one thing, that that's dangerous. If there's onshoring, that will come at their expense. By the way, onshoring won't necessarily bring jobs back to wealthy countries because there is a literature that asks the question whether those jobs now will be replaced by automation. And then finally, there is a huge problem with water in many developing countries. And those countries that are suffering water scarcities are going to have a very hard time doing the elementary thing, which is hand washing. So 2 notes before I leave you. One is, and this includes me, beware of prognostications, because we are in an age where people are required to pronounce instantaneously on big subjects. I'm telling you what I know based on the evidence, but I cannot tell you how this will turn out. And if anybody does tell you that, reach for your back pocket. There are huge variations. When will a vaccine come about? How expensive will it be? Will poor countries in the world be able to afford it? Will there be intellectual property dispute issues that prevent it from being reverse engineered or made generically in other countries? And then finally, of course, what will be the effect of reopening, which is happening in parts of Europe and China? President Trump wants it to happen here. We have no idea whether the virus will come roaring back. There are some good news, 2 pieces. I want to end on a positive note. One is that air quality has increased tremendously. So if you go to New Delhi now, and you look at the India Gate, which you couldn't see from a mile, you can actually see it clearly. Same in various parts of this country. The second is renewable energy has picked up because the demand for conventional coal-fired energy, which was the largest segment of the electricity generation in this country, has gone down. And so wind and hydroelectricity are providing a much greater proportion of total US energy than ever before. So on that relatively optimistic note, I'll leave you. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Rajan. Marta.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marta Bengoa, professor from the Department of Economics and Business, and I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to speak about the economic implications of the pandemic and the policy responses, mainly from a macroeconomic point of view. So the pandemic has forced us to stay at home to stop the spread of the virus, creating an unprecedented economic crisis. So right now, the economy is in a medically induced coma to save lives until treatment is available. So this has created two shocks. By one side, a supply shock that has been followed by a sharp drop in demand. What is this? The supply shock reflects or affects the production side. So the firms, the non-essential firms, are all mostly closed, and that affects productivity and productions. Also prices and employment. And we have seen and observed global disruptions in the global value chains, in the way firms produce. That has been the supply shock that has been accompanied by a demand side. So we are all at home. So by being at home, households, consumption and investment has dropped substantially. And we have to realize that in 2019, 70% of the GDP was coming from the consumption side. So these both effects, the supply side and demand side shock, combined has created what we call the coronavirus recession. This recession is severe, and the damage in the US economy is gonna last for years. Of course, there is gonna be heterogeneity across the states, and that will depend on how states respond to the reopening and how they respond to stop the spread of the virus. But right now, we don't know how this is gonna happen. So this is the effect on growth, and it's gonna be another effect on employment. How bad this is gonna be? Unfortunately, I don't have quite good news. The picture is really dire, it's really grim. So what you see here is during the first quarter of 2020, the output has declined by 5%. This is in line with other countries as France, Italy, or Spain that are suffering large outbreaks. How the future is gonna look like? So the estimations for the next quarter, for the second quarter, are really, really bad. You have them in the chart over here. So it is expected that the GDP is going to drop by 11%. To put it in perspective, the largest drop in output in the United States was by 10% in 1948. And now we are expecting a drop by 11%. And this is the most optimistic forecast. Of course, this is a projection, but projections are very good to anchor expectations. And right now I want to anchor yours. So if you have a look here at the shadow range, this is the 95% confidence interval. So in the most pessimistic scenario, what we have here is a drop below 30%. So a contraction by 30% of the GDP. What is going to be then the effect on employment? So here you have the labor market. So we believe that right now the unemployment rate is about 20%, which is close to the Great Depression. For the last 6 weeks, we have seen that 30.3 million people have claimed unemployment benefits. Unemployment insurance claims have topped to 30.3 million. Compare that to the Great Recession here. You see, we are off the charts right now. Of course, the good news is that once the economy will start reopening, some of the workers will go back to their former jobs, but that's no guarantee whatsoever. Why? Because some of the firms may be closed, or some of the firms permanently declared bankrupt. So we are going to have mismatches in between employers and employees. And how large are going to be those mismatches? The answer is we don't know yet. But we know that right now we are off the charts. So if we combine the effect that I already spoke about regarding the drop in the GDP growth and the effects on unemployment, what we have is the ingredients for a depression. We still are calling it coronavirus recession, but I do believe that we may be heading to a large depression. Also, wherever coronavirus goes, it amplifies the existing problems. It's something that Rajan in his exposition already mentioned. One of the biggest problems in the US economy is inequality. So right now what we are observing is that those individuals, consumers and households that are staying home, they are still employed and they are earning income. However, they are not consuming much. So we are seeing in the economy a huge increase in private savings, but those private savings are not being canalized into investment. Because during a pandemic, who is going to buy a house? Who is going to buy an apartment? Who is going to build a park? Who is going to build a school? Nobody does that. So we have an increase in private savings that is going to come handy to pay off the debts, but that right now is not being canalized into investment. And on the other side, we have the individuals losing their incomes, which leads to less spending, business closures, and more layoffs. So we are getting into a downward spiral similar to the other recessions, but deeper, in which the most vulnerable households are being hit the first. Here you have, I placed the map of New York City. What you see in the yellow areas, those yellow areas are the ones that they register the most the highest infection rate. What we see is these areas, the Bronx and Queens, are highly correlated with low-income households, also with households with high density, so the number of people living in the household is large, and longer commutes. So the coronavirus crisis is exacerbating the inequality problem that we already have, and is deepening, and is polarizing. So that's why Senate governors want to reopen the economy, probably quickly, because they need to put these workers out there to start moving the economy. Is this wise? No, it is not wise at all. So what policymakers need to do? Right now, policymakers need to do more. They need to put money into people's pockets. It is true that the Fed and Congress have stepped up. Fed has guaranteed the liquidity in the system. When there is a global crisis, everybody wants dollars. So the Fed has guaranteed that there is enough dollars in the system, so we have liquidity and we don't have another financial crisis on top of the coronavirus crisis. And for the first time in history, the Fed is lending to medium-sized businesses directly and also to local governments, giving loans to state and local governments. But that is not going to be enough. Congress has approved relief packages in 2 sequences for more than $3 trillion. That's huge, unprecedented amount. That covers rebates to families, unemployment benefits, the PPP program. We have many problems with the internet system to actually process the 30.3 million claims in unemployment benefits, and the plenty of PPP companies that are actually filed for that. But the help is out there. But this is probably not enough. Why is not going to be enough? Because we don't know how long this is going to last. So, and right now we have a dire problem with the states and municipalities. They need help. Down the line, after the summer, probably after July, people are going to need more assistance because they are going to be running out of the unemployment benefits. So, I'm wrapping up. How is the recovery going to look like? Is going to be a V shape? Is going to be a W shape? Is going to be a Nike logo shape? As Rajan mentioned, nobody knows. If I had to bet on something, the recovery is going to be like a Nike logo, but it's going to go slowly. It's going to take substantial time for the US economy to recover. And that is going to only be determined by the containment of the public health crisis. I would like to end with a positive note. If test and tracing, which is now going to be in place in New York, work, our future will be slightly better until treatment is discovered, but that's not guaranteed yet. And I'm sorry to bring in such a awful news to all of you. Thank you.
Marta, thank you very much. And I might mention as we transition over to Katherine, that New York City is putting a significant tracing program in place that involves opportunities for CUNY, including our faculty, our staff, and our students. So keep an eye out if you're interested and available to be a part of efforts to improve the quality of tracing efforts in New York City. CUNY is providing those opportunities. Katherine.
Great, thank you. I'm Professor Katherine Chen. I'm from the Department of Sociology. I've been asked to provide an organizational perspective on this pandemic response because I'm an organizational researcher. So taking a step back, so as we've seen in countries like Taiwan and South Korea, they've had previous experiences with SARS-1 when they started hearing news from China about SARS-2, which is what some people call COVID-19. their governmental agencies immediately undertook contract tracing, testing, and quarantining those who were traveling from other areas or who had possible exposure. Through these swift containment actions, their governments have preserved more certainty for their societies. In contrast, countries that haven't taken such actions are experiencing more instability, uncertainty, and unpredictability, such as disruptions and breakdowns in the supply chain for goods like personal protection equipment, sick employees, and large-scale job losses, as we've just seen from the previous presenters. In these countries, which includes the US, organizations such as universities and schools, workplaces, restaurants, businesses, and government offices don't know when and how they can reopen and to what extent they can resume operations, right? So right now the big question is, what is the fall gonna look like, right? Now the best such organizations can do is to extrapolate from what our organizations other countries have done, right? Looking at China, Hong Kong, for example, or many organizations in states that are reopening right now will find firsthand, unfortunately, probably when they reopen and when they might have to reclose when new outbreaks arise. So 3 points, what this pandemic has revealed to us. First and foremost, it reveals a deep extent to which people and organizations are all interconnected and interdependent, and how a belief in the collective can actually help sustain people through crises like these. So on the one hand, we have certain elite and business interests who would like people to disregard this interdependence in terms of our public health. Such interest groups have funded and astroturf groups, as we've seen in the media, to run small protests that attract a lot of media coverage. Such groups have exploited individualist, rights-based discourse to advance their cause. These interests demand a return to business as usual, as in the past, without sufficient testing, unfortunately. But without access to adequate healthcare support, certain populations, as we've seen already in New York City, those who are more disadvantaged and more vulnerable will probably suffer more losses than others, and these losses will impact greater society as well. On the other hand, we do see, with people in New York City and elsewhere, volunteering and forming mutual aid organizations. So you may have seen advertisements like flyers saying, do you need help? We're here to help you, right? These are volunteer groups, informal groups where people have volunteered to coordinate activities in recognition of our interdependence. For example, mutual aid organizations have collected and distributed personal protection equipment, things like masks, to frontline healthcare workers whose organizations have failed or unable to provide these. They've also shopped and delivered medicine and goods for older adults and those who have health conditions who can't leave their homes. There's also groups that have tested populations, volunteers, doctors, and nurses who can't practice in the US, for example, but have medical licenses from other countries, have formed testing sites to offer support to those who don't have normal access to healthcare. And we also have mutual aid groups which have offered support for those who are socially isolated. Mutual aid organizations are among the oldest forms of organizations that predate what we take for granted, for-profit organizations, voluntary associations, and they embody and they recognize how we have collective responsibilities to each other. Second point, this pandemic has revealed how most organizations assume that operating conditions are stable. With this pandemic, as it started to unfold, many of these organizations have needed help with recognizing when and how they need to shift operations. This help has come from people like medical experts, organizational researchers such as myself, stakeholders who can encourage organizations to replace standard operating procedures and practices with ones that can actually work and adapt to the landscape that we have now. Organizations will need to think more creatively about what is possible, especially as people have increased caregiving and community building responsibilities. Stakeholders need to pressure the government to gather and coordinate resources and also to protect the more vulnerable. So for example, we can encourage you all to make sure that you and your local communities complete the census, right, which is tied to getting resources from the government. We've seen how these kinds of efforts can work from before with the HIV/AIDS crisis. Now we need to rethink what has worked in the past and come to terms with whether previous practices and values can still serve the collective interest. We've seen some organizations have pivoted in terms of what they provide. So for example, some restaurants no longer they no longer do in-person dining, but they now supply and feed people who are homeless, for example. Secondly, we also need to hold organizations, particularly large multinational organizations, more accountable to their employees, stakeholders, and society. As we've seen, many of these large organizations like cruise ships that continue to run cruises despite knowing their risks. Energy firms, finance companies, and retail firms have passed on increasingly irreparable costs to society at large without sharing the burden. So they've been reaping profits while asking for handouts on the one hand. Such organizations have placed their workers and customers at risk, and they inflict environmental damage that increase the likelihood that we're going to experience more of these kinds of difficult to contain pandemics. So what can we do instead? So some groups have already done things like start economic solidarity projects, such as Cooperation Jackson, where people form worker cooperatives, which have a commitment to supporting local business and employment rather than relying on globalization to provide all those the supplies. These offer an alternative to dependency on large multinational firms for the provisions of goods and services. If we can revitalize our sense of interdependence among people and nature at large, perhaps we can restore a more sustainable balance where future generations can thrive rather than suffer. So those are my concluding points. Thank you so much.
Katherine, thank you. And our last speaker, Stan.
Well, thank you, Andrew. So the issue that I'm going to talk about today, as Andrew said at the beginning, is about the digital divide, which is an interesting sounding term, but it's really one that's now affecting everybody's life, particularly as we've had the stay-at-home order requiring people to not go to public meeting places like school, for example, and requiring that education now be done online, which then raised the issue of, if we're going to do online education, the underlying assumption is that everybody has access to the internet and everybody has access to a computer or a tablet that allows you to access information on the internet. And what we've discovered is that that's not true. We've discovered that in large part, the internet has provided access to educational resources for individuals who are more privileged, who have the ability to buy equipment, who have the ability to have their parents or themselves pay for the subscription fees to access internet services. And what we increasingly find, some of which is not new information, is that individual households in low-income communities throughout New York and throughout the country, as well as rural communities, do not have access to the internet. And if they do have access, it may be at speeds that are really quite slow compared to the kinds of speeds required in today's world. The 21st century is in its infancy in many ways. We're in the first decade of the 21st century, but it's clear that the way the world operates and the way in which commerce is done and the way work is organized is quite different from the 20th century. In this age, what we find is that technological disruption has changed the way we do almost every piece of our daily business and the way we work. What we're going to discover, I think, quite rapidly when we move away from this stay-at-home regulation that we're under is that much of what we have been required to do today as a result of staying at home, working from home, the ability to do online education is not going to suddenly disappear and have us revert back to the way it was before the coronavirus hit. I think we're going to find people discover businesses are going to realize that much of what they do can be done from home. We're going to still have imposed upon us, at least through the fall, this requirement that we can't gather and we have to concern ourselves with 6-foot spacings. If that's the case, we're not going to suddenly come back to City College and other parts of the university or even the public schools where everyone is going to return back to the classroom. Therefore, I think what we need to begin to focus on is how we address the social inequity that's now become painfully obvious as households, and I think the controller's report in 2018 estimated that there was just under 1 million households throughout New York City that did not have access to the internet. And as we've seen with the announcement of going online education, both the public school system and the university needed to make available to its students tablets for many students who had no access at all. So I think we're going to have to adjust to an age in which we're going to have to recognize that the information highway is now an essential part of everyday life. And dealing with the idea of how to address this inequity, the country has done this numerous times before. During the 1800s, when Lincoln was president, we really didn't have an easy way to traverse the entire country. And so the federal government put up money to complete the Intercontinental Railroad. In the 1930s, when it was clear that electricity became an important part of everyday life, and most communities in urban settings had electricity, but only 10% of rural communities had electricity, the federal government put up money to electrify the country. In the 1950s, the federal government put up money to build the highway system that we now benefit today to be able to travel around the country in fair ease. So in the 21st century, we have an information highway, which is how we get information, how we do commerce, how we order goods. And so during the whole debate in Washington, when all of this money is being spent, I think it's an opportunity to actually look at funds being invested in building this information highway out so that all urban communities, whether poor or not, whether rural or urban or suburban, have access to the internet. There is a bill in Congress that's sponsored by Congressman James Clyburn from South Carolina, which is to put $80 billion of funding from the federal government to build out the internet. One of the things is Katherine talked about organizational responses and the fact that we're living in an age of interdependence. I'm by training, I'm an engineer. I got my undergraduate degree at City College and have, through further education, become very intrigued and work much with systems. So we're dealing with a complex system here. It's been easy to hide that fact from ourselves and think you can deal with pieces at a time. But it's a complex system, and when you change one part of it, often unintended consequences occur in other parts of it. One example that struck me this morning in reading the paper is what happens with the school system when a student doesn't show up to classes for several consecutive days. Apparently, there is a rule that says if a student doesn't show up to class for 3 consecutive days, the teacher is responsible to file a kind of a claim with the Administration for Children's Services that there may be something wrong going on with that child in their household. And that can trigger the Administration for Children's Services sending out a caseworker to the home. Well, just imagine the situation, and the report cited several actual cases where I'm at home, my child is now required to do classes through the internet. We don't have access to the internet. We don't have a tablet, or in one case, we do have a tablet for my youngest child, and therefore we can't get on the classes for 2 or 3 or 4 days. Well, what's begun to happen is caseworkers are now showing up at individual homes wanting to know why the family is not participating in education under the assumption that the family's at fault. All of this just perpetuates this idea of social injustice. And I think unless we begin to really look at how we're functioning as a society, we're not only going to disrupt education and make it even worse for people in low-income communities, but that's where all of the emerging jobs are in the tech sector. We're only going to see more and more technical innovation. And I think, as several of my colleagues have said earlier, some of the jobs are not going to come back. As we change the supply chain and where the point of origin for manufacturing happens, much of the production may be automated. And so jobs that would have continued may now be lost. I think a place like City College has a unique role to play in this. It's been our history from the very, very beginning in the founding principles of the college in order to create opportunities for people who would not normally be able to go to college or enter the economy because of the lack of means. I think we as a campus located in Harlem have a unique responsibility to try to create whole other opportunities, not only to access the internet, but begin to excite young people, particularly people of color, about the opportunities in higher education and in technology. And from that point of view, to answer a point that Andrew made earlier, Bernard Baruch graduated from City College in 1989. And if most people don't know who Bernard Baruch is, he's not just the person that Baruch College is named after. He was born in the South. He was born in South Carolina. His family moved to New York in the mid 1880s. He went to college in the urban, in the City College's early days. In graduating in 1989, as I've often told students, he didn't have a job, but his father introduced him to one of his clients. His father was a doctor. He went to work on Wall Street, and before he was 30 years old, he made his first $1 million. And before he was 30 years old, he lost his first $1 million. And over the years, Bernard was a very, very successful investor. And in the early part of the 20th century, Bernard was on the board of trustees of City College and was intrigued by Woodrow Wilson's desire to become president. And so he left the trustee board and went off to work as an advisor in Washington. And it's interesting, the whole experience we're going through with this pandemic, because when Bernard in the early 1900s was in Washington, a war broke out in Europe. And during the course of the debate going on in the United States about whether we would enter the war, it was pretty clear that we were not equipped. We had no real army. We didn't have armament. Our industrial complex was not geared towards war. And so as an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, Bernard was engaged in many efforts up through the entrance of the war in volunteer efforts to figure out how the United States was going to respond to this. And eventually it was decided that the only way to address getting ready and participate effectively in the war would be to create the War Industrial Board, which was a board that then, in a sense, had the first War Powers Act that we've debated about with the current president. And what Bernard did as chairman of that industrial board is he made it clear to industry that we now had a responsibility to try to focus the nation's resources on addressing the war that we had just entered. And there were many efforts by large industrial groups, including the steel industry, to try to make a profit on war. And it was Bernard's position that that was irresponsible and unacceptable, and the options under the War Powers Act or the War Industrial Board was, unless there was an agreement to reasonable profits and focusing on the war effort, the country would simply nationalize industries, including the steel industry. And as a result, there was a much more cooperative spirit. Bernard believed that industry and government primary roles were to serve society and not to serve each other. And as soon as things got imbalanced, we would have a problem like we see today. In spite of the fact that there are bills to support and bail out small businesses, a significant part of the bailout is really going to larger companies who probably require less of a bailout than small businesses and individuals. So Bernard is an interesting individual to kind of learn more about. I've learned to appreciate what he's written and to look for what he suggested. One of the names that have been attributed to Bernard, who advised 9 presidents, starting with Woodrow Wilson all the way through Lyndon Baines Johnson, is they called him Mr. Facts, because Bernard believed that you needed to look at what the facts and the data were in order to make informed decisions. It wasn't just about being emotional or just having a special interest. If you were going to do and make decisions that affected society in a meaningful way, then you needed to really understand what was happening. And he, in many ways, took a very broad systems approach. So I think we're faced at a point where life is going to be changed. I don't think we're going to go back to old ways of doing business. I agree with my colleagues. It's hard to predict how this is going to play out. But I think we have to adapt to it. And I think City College and other campuses within the university are going to have a unique role to play, because we serve a significant portion of the lower income community in New York, which has historically been our mission. And I think we need to figure out how we're doing that in spite of the fact that we're being underfunded. But the challenge is still there. And I think from my own experience and from what I've seen over the years, we're up to doing the task. And I think it's going to be an interesting and challenging time ahead of us. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back to you, Andrew.
Great. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all 5 speakers. I mean, it's a lot to take in and a lot of to digest, and certainly not a lot of good news in what we're hearing at this point, but also it organizes the ways we can think about what we're experiencing and what we're consuming in the news. And I'm grateful for the depth of the analysis that you've shared. We've got a few questions, and I want to invite folks who have questions to share them in the chat, or just indicate in the chat that you'd like to ask them. But we have a question that I think might go to Professor Menon, that asked what you think the future of international organizations is. This really goes to Katherine Chen too. What is the future of international organizations? How well are they responding? How do they see their role, and how do others see their roles? And in particular, are they playing a meaningful enough role in supporting research on a vaccine and political negotiations to support the peoples of countries that are particularly poorly.
Katherine, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about research. So I think countries that are going to do better in terms of developing treatments or vaccines are the ones that have historically supported their research universities and promoted cooperation with industry. And probably countries like Germany are going to be ahead of the curve compared to places like the US, which, as we're seeing, right, has increasingly underfunded, for example, state institutions where many of these innovations could take place. So I think that could be increased.
So a quick word. International organizations are not popular in some sections of American discourse, but one has to remember that all of the institutions that exist now were part of what was called the American-led order, the Pax Americana, be it the World Trade Organization, before that it was called GATT, be it the IMF, be it the World Bank, and a whole host of other things. But international organizations cannot do what their members won't allow them to do. It's a mistake to see them as these entities that stand above states and can coordinate and decide and allocate resources. So let me give you some examples. Take the UN Department of Peacekeeping that introduces troops in an ideal world to separate two sides that are involved in a conflict. It's responsible for the entire world, but it has a budget that's equal to the NYPD and the FDNY put together. Take the World Food Program. It has to care for many millions of refugees. And there is constant complaint, rightly so, about the inability to care for these refugees. But every year, the World Food Program and its parent, the UNHCR, stands hat in hand begging for money to be provided. The final thing to bear in mind is that these institutions can't be abstracted from underlying power realities. So the IMF, for example, is based on weighted voting. The more you capitalize the bank, the bigger your role. It's very difficult to imagine a loan going through the World Bank that the United States and some other wealthy countries don't want it to go through. The WTO's rules were designed by the United States. It's a more competitive economy now. Some of us anyway, don't like what those rules are. but it was done with the consent of the countries concerned. So how these institutions work depend on two things: how much power they're given, and in a state-based world, they're not given very much, and how much resources they're given, and they're under-resourced. So I would say they can do a lot, but not at the level at which they're being funded now. I'm not necessarily advocating that they should play a huge role in this, but the reality is one has to expect from them only what can reasonably be expected.
We have a couple of questions. Oh, sorry. Yeah, please, Marta.
Yeah, I would like to say a few words about the IMF. We are seeing already a change, a completely 180-degree shift in the way they are approaching this crisis. For the first time, they are talking about debt relief and actually condoning the debt. So they are encouraging less developed countries to go into debt to save lives. And they are telling them, hey, we are going to issue loans. They are going to be soft. And if you can't repay, we will actually put that off the books, which is a huge change in the paradigm. Fortunately enough, the chief economist is Gita Gopinath from Harvard University, economics department. So she really knows what, she's been working on her life into studying the less developing economies from a macro and micro perspective. And she has induced a huge change in the way the IMF is approaching the crisis to help less developing countries. And that's important to notice because it's a change.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that go to David. The question, David, is, you said the virus is not alive. So what gives it the motivation, so to speak, to procreate and replicate? And then could you speak a little more about what the leading research is right now on vaccines and how you see that evolving?
Right. So I think it's a good question about what gives it its motivation to live. It's hard to answer because they occupy this space between living and non-living. So, for example, one can grow crystals of a virus just like you can grow salt or sugar crystals, but salt or sugar don't give you the same kind of disease. Some have thought of viruses as poisons, but I think the proper place for them is between living and non-living. And what gives them their motivation to replicate is that the genome, the DNA, has encoded in it in some way that we don't understand. It has a will to live, just like all of our DNAs have will to live and pass on our genomes to the next generation. About vaccines, so as a general matter, the vaccine is a way to train the human body to resist an infection that comes later. And so historically, this has been done by giving attenuated versions of a virus, let's say, or such thing. And today there are more elaborate and more sophisticated approaches, but the general approach is to introduce a viral protein or in some way to present it to the immune system so that it can train itself while not causing the disease in the first place. So there are various ways to do that. It probably would take us a little bit to describe, but these are very difficult to produce because not every protein produces the same kind of protective effect that we'd want, and they are not quick to produce. And so I think 18 months or so is a sensible amount of time, and clearly many companies and governments will try to accelerate that as much as possible. Whether they will or not is we'll have to see.
We have a question from Seb Rotz.
Yeah.
Is Seb ready to ask a question?
Sure. Hear me?
Yep, we can.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I'm a graduate student at City College. And so I have kind of two questions. The first comment is thank you for such a nice event. I wish it was on TV so more people can be educated about what's going on and not have to listen to the news. So my question is, do you think, or do you foresee in your projections the possibility that some of the countries that are being affected the most, especially the bigger countries, may engage in some type of war? One, to save face at home, to support their right-wing supporters, and also to bet, wrong bet, I believe, that their economies will be jump-started by starting a war. So that's one question. And then number two, what about the possibility do you see in your conclusions along the lines the changes in laws? So, for example, banks and super rich do not continue to support this imbalanced systems, especially in healthcare, that can also have added to what we see out there. Certain groups being affected most because of a lack of a quality healthcare.
Big questions. Who on the panel might like to address those?
I can start.
Yeah.
There's actually a fair amount of empirical research in my field on the question of whether domestic turmoil of whatever sort makes countries more warlike. And the general consensus is it doesn't, for two reasons. People generally tend not to focus on foreign affairs as much as people like me think they ought to. It's a little world that we live in, and most people are too busy with their ordinary lives. The second is that, the idea that war is a paying proposition is highly debatable, because very often it kills things and destroys property, and there are not many wars where people have waged them to come out ahead. That said, you raise a very good question. So you have at the moment a very delicate stage in historical terms. You have a power, the United States, that's been on top of the power curve for about a generation. And as always happens, because partly of its own doing, its spread of technology, education, finance, and what have you, other centers of power emerge. And the rising power, the dominant power tries to manage this initially. But then one of them breaks out of the pack and begins what we call a power transition. And at the point where the two lines are intersecting, one curve and the other curve, the point before that is called a crisis power transition, and it's the most dangerous time. So this is roughly what we're seeing now between the United States and China. So we're way off from this. And at the moment, they've already begun a kind of war over the virus. Was it created by a lab in Wuhan? President Trump said, I'll cut off assistance to the WHO unless it's called the Chinese virus. The Chinese social media, encouraged by the state, are putting out messages that the United States biolabs created the virus. And so not a war, but I think we'll all be worse off if the major powers are either internally divided or pitting themselves one against the other, short of going to war.
And we've got two more questions of people who have their hands up here. And so we're going to take those before we conclude. And Norma Fuentes is next.
Hello. I don't know.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to ask Professor Bengoa. She showed a map of the city showing that the biggest areas affected by COVID-19 look like the Bronx and Queens, and where most immigrants and Latinos, at least the recently migrants, have settled. So I'd like to ask her if she knows. I understand that 70% of the necessary essential workers are immigrants. I'm sorry, 60%, and 70% of those are undocumented. I'm wondering if she knows, if she can speak a little more about those communities, if there's going to be, if she expects that there's going to be an increasing backlash and stigmatization, since those communities are the ones most affected. I mean, they are, on the one hand, paradoxically, the ones sustaining the economy right now, the lower level and the low wage, and yet they are also the one affected. Some of my students were attacked in the bus and discriminated. You know, people sneezing on top of my Asian students. But I don't know how the Latino community is experiencing this.
Hi, Norma. Thank you. A good question. So what we have been observing is that there is a high correlation, association in between communities that are living, that are commuting, have longer commutes, also that have lower income, and they live in households with more than 2-3 persons. And those are the immigrants, mainly immigrants and vulnerable communities that live in the Bronx and deep in Queens and some of them in Brooklyn. So it's associated, they still need to go to work. They are going to work. They are commuting for longer hours. So they are getting infected. They have a higher likelihood to be infected. There is no cause effect study on those spaces yet out there, but we know that we have associations. Answering about the fact if they are being discriminated, I don't have the data for that, but I recently read an article that the New York City, it is actually putting a campaign out there to try to stop discrimination towards minority communities, especially Asian. But I taking into Rajan's point, we are moving into a more polarized environment. Politics are being really polarized, to the left and to the right, and that brings up sexism, racism out there. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a surge in those kind of attacks. I don't have the data to answer that, but I know that the New York City has put out there a campaign against racism and is releasing videos already. And the wife of one of our professors, Professor De, works in that campaign precisely. Because we are observing an increasing trend in attacks motivated by racism. I don't know exactly it is against the Latino community, the Black community, but we know we are observing an increasing trend. And it's becoming because the world is really polarized.
We're going to take the last question from Theodora. I want to thank everyone who's asked questions in the chat space, and we'll share those with our speakers. And you should feel free to reach out to folks who've been on the panel if you want answers on some of the questions we haven't been able to get to. But Theodora, do you want to ask the last question?
Yeah. Hello?
Yep, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, my question, I forgot. I wrote it in the chat.
Ah, okay. Well, here you wrote here. What are the what can they tell us about the backlash from COVID-19? And are there ways that the money that is being allocated can go to the communities that are at the highest risk? I don't know if there's anyone on the panel who wants to kind of speak to.
Well, they are already going. I mean, you have to apply for unemployment insurance. The problem is if we have immigrants that they are no legal immigrants, so they are out of the system.
I'm not talking about unemployment benefit.
Right.
Okay.
I'm talking about like the way that they're doing it in the UK and like in Canada, like giving like people $2,000 a month until the
by a check. Yeah, that will be ideal. Actually, that's a good question. That will be ideal. Here, they are even thinking about payroll cuts or payroll tax cuts, which is a really bad idea because nobody, I mean, many individuals are not on payroll. Right now, that is not on the table. That was one of my remarks, like put my money in people's pockets. That is not being done, as in Canada and UK. They are not extending checks. That is not on the table yet, but we don't know after July if the situation gets more dire, if it will be on the table.
Andrew,
legislation on that.
Andrew, let me chime in a bit here. I think in response to the question, I think part of the issue we're facing is this enormous polarization that takes place in Washington. Clearly, the Senate Republicans have put forth several proposals that would not fund and channel resources to municipal government, local governments and state based on the impact of the pandemic, but have done it in a ways that kind of benefit this, as they refer to red states over blue states. I think it's the same issue of the way in which the Senate has responded to issues of how the $2 trillion has been allocated, including this relaxing of some of the tax benefits that were restricted in the 2017 tax bill that gives major investors and large corporations added tax benefits, which is the thing Bernard was trying to avoid with large corporations during the war. What we've now done is we've given large tax benefits to people who clearly don't need it. So I do think the problem we have is also a really serious political one, where it's only going to address if we restructure the politics in this country, where we get back to focusing on trying to solve problems rather than trying to have special interests and political advantages being the primary issue of what federal government is doing.
So as a political scientist, I think that's a good note to end on. We clearly have significant political problems, although they're not our only problems at this moment. I want to thank all 5 of our panelists very much for providing such a provocative statement. Yeah, we can't, I feel like one of the things you get with Zoom is everybody gets a front row seat, but one of the things you can't really do is applaud the way you might like, or go up and talk to the speakers afterwards. But each of these folks is a professor on our campus, and so for the students particularly, but for all of us for whom they're our colleagues, you can find their contact information on the City College website. My thanks to all of them. I want to mention just one other thing. We're going to have a second event this Thursday that looks in an even more specific way at how the pandemic has created issues for our campus community and for Harlem. And we have 3 members of our psychology department and 1 person in our political science department to be part of a conversation about how our students have been affected, how the families that work in our community have been affected, and how those who live nearby campus have been affected. And one of the things we'll be doing on Thursday is sharing the first look at results of a new survey of our students, where we have, I think, 3,700 responses on how the pandemic has affected their lives. And the person, Sasha Rudenstein, who has done that study, will be sharing the first results. So I invite you to join us. That's on Thursday at 12:30. We'll send the link out to everyone who attended today so that you have it if you can join us then. Again, thanks to the panelists. Thanks to all of you for spending some time with us, and have a good day. Take care and stay safe.